Sarah Williams stood at the viewport of the transport shuttle, watching the crystalline spires of Nexus Prime grow larger as they approached the planet's surface. At 34, she had never imagined she would be traveling to another world, let alone as Earth's first educational representative to the Galactic Academy. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was here because she had lost her job. Budget cuts had eliminated her special education position at Lincoln Elementary, along with her carefully crafted programs for children who learned differently. The academy rose from the planet's surface like a living jewel, its translucent walls shifting through spectrums of light that hurt her eyes to look at directly. Through the neural interface translation device fitted behind her ear, she could hear the gentle hum of thousands of alien minds connected to the vast information networks that powered galactic education. It was beautiful, efficient, and completely unlike anything humans had ever created. Dr. Vexhai waited for her at the transport platform, their tall, ethereal form moving with the fluid grace typical of the luminar species. Their translucent blue skin pulsed with soft bioluminescent patterns that Sarah's translation device helpfully informed her indicated polite welcome mixed with mild curiosity. "Welcome to the Galactic Academy, Professor Williams," Vexhai said, their voice carrying harmonic overtones that the translator rendered as formal but not unfriendly. "I trust your journey from Earth was comfortable." Sarah adjusted the strap of her single permitted personal bag, which contained little more than clothes and her grandmother's acoustic guitar. "It was incredible, thank you. I'm honored to be here." As they walked through corridors filled with beings from a dozen different species, Vexhai explained the Academy's educational philosophy. Neuralink learning allowed students to download information directly into their minds, process it through quantum-enhanced cognitive networks, and demonstrate mastery through instantaneous recall and application. Most students could absorb the equivalent of years of human education in mere weeks. "It's remarkably efficient," Sarah said, though something in her tone must have conveyed her uncertainty. Vexhai's bioluminescent patterns shifted to what the translator identified as mild concern. "You sound hesitant, Professor. Is there something about our methods that troubles you?" Sarah chose her words carefully. "On Earth, we've learned that the fastest way to teach isn't always the best way to learn. Sometimes understanding takes time to develop." "An interesting perspective," Vexhai replied, though their patterns suggested polite disagreement. "You'll find that perspective quite relevant to your assignment." They arrived at a smaller wing of the academy, noticeably quieter than the main corridors. Vexhai's manner became more serious as they approached a classroom door. "Your students are what we classify as remedial cases," Vexhai explained. "They've proven unable to adapt to our standard Neuralink educational systems. Previous instructors have struggled to make progress with them." The classroom was smaller than Sarah had expected, with 5 students scattered around the space like islands of isolation. Her heart immediately went out to them. She recognized the postures and expressions of children who had been labeled as failures too many times. Near the window sat a Skittari, a species she recognized from her briefing materials. About the size of a human child but covered in iridescent scales, they bounced restlessly in their seat, 6 limbs tapping out complex rhythms on every available surface. In the corner, a mollusk had retreated almost entirely into their shell, only the tips of their sensory tentacles visible. A young Drachnari, reptilian and naturally aggressive, sat with arms crossed and an expression of barely contained anger. An Etherian floated listlessly near the ceiling, their translucent form flickering with depression. But it was the 5th student who captured Sarah's attention completely. Zix sat motionless in the center of the room, a crystalline being roughly the size of a human teenager. Their body was composed of living crystal that should have shifted through beautiful colors to reflect their emotions and thoughts. Instead, they were a dull, lifeless gray, the color Sarah's briefing materials had mentioned, of despair or cognitive shutdown among their species. "Zix has been with us for 8 months, Vexhai said quietly. Crystallines typically require decades to develop their harmonic learning abilities, but at 15, Zix shows no signs of cognitive development. We've tried every modification to our Neuralink systems, but there's simply no response. Sarah approached Zix slowly, studying the intricate patterns in their crystal surface. Even gray and dormant, there was something beautiful about the geometric structures that made up their form. "Have you tried non-technological approaches?" Sarah asked. Vexhi's patterns indicated confusion. "I'm not sure what you mean. Our systems represent the most advanced educational technology in the galaxy. On Earth, we have a saying, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Sometimes the most advanced solution isn't the right solution." The next week was a period of observation and frustration. Sarah watched as instructor after instructor attempted to connect the remedial students to various Neuralink modifications, each session ending in failure. The Skittari became increasingly agitated when forced to remain still for the connections. The mollusk retreated further into their shell. The Drachnari's anger grew more pronounced. The Etherians seemed to fade a little more each day. And Zix never moved, never responded, never showed any sign of awareness. Sarah spent her evenings in her quarters, researching everything she could find about each species. The Academy's databases were incredibly comprehensive, but she found herself gravitating toward historical and cultural information rather than the technical specifications that seemed to obsess her alien colleagues. Crystallines, she learned, had once been the galaxy's greatest mathematicians and philosophers. Their ancient texts spoke of learning through harmonic resonance, a process where knowledge was absorbed and processed through complex sound and vibration patterns. But modern crystalline education had abandoned these methods centuries ago in favor of more efficient Neuralink technology. The breakthrough came accidentally. Sarah was alone in the classroom after hours, grading what passed for assignments among students who couldn't properly interface with the Academy's systems. Frustrated and homesick, she began humming unconsciously, an old lullaby her grandmother had sung to her as a child. A faint shimmer caught her eye. Zix's gray crystal surface had flickered with the tiniest hint of blue. Sarah stopped humming and the color faded immediately. Heart racing, she began the lullaby again, this time watching Zix intently. The blue returned, stronger now, spreading in ripples across their crystalline form. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered. "You can hear me." The next morning, Sarah arrived at the classroom carrying her guitar case. Dr. Vexhi intercepted her at the door, their bioluminescent patterns indicating skepticism and concern. "Professor Williams, I've been reviewing your requests for alternative teaching materials. I'm not sure how primitive musical instruments relate to advanced education." "Dr. Vexhi, what if our definition of advanced is actually holding these students back?" Sarah set up her guitar in the classroom, ignoring the curious and skeptical looks from her colleagues. The other remedial students watched with interest. They had learned to expect the unexpected from their human teacher. When Sarah began to play, the transformation was immediate and dramatic. Zix's entire body began to resonate, their crystal surface shifting through brilliant blues and purples. The geometric patterns within their form became more complex, creating intricate mandalas that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the music. But Zix wasn't the only one responding. The hyperactive Skittari's constant motion began to synchronize with the rhythm, their movements becoming less frantic and more purposeful. The mollusk emerged slightly from their shell, sensory tentacles swaying gently. Even the angry Drachnari seemed to relax, their aggressive posture softening. "Fascinating," Dr. Vexhi murmured, their patterns shifting to intense curiosity. "But how does this translate to actual learning?" Sarah smiled, transitioning to a simple melody with mathematical progressions built into the chord structure. "Watch." As she played, she began incorporating basic mathematical concepts into the rhythm and melody. Simple addition and subtraction represented through ascending and descending scales. Multiplication through harmonic intervals. Division through rhythmic subdivisions. Zix's response was extraordinary. Their crystal body began generating its own harmonic frequencies, creating three-dimensional patterns in the air above them. Each mathematical concept Sarah introduced was reflected back as complex geometric forms that hung in space like living equations. They're not just learning, Sarah realized aloud. They're processing information in a completely different way. Over the following weeks, Sarah developed individual approaches for each of her students. The Skittari learned through movement, solving problems while engaged in complex physical activities. The mollusk responded to gentle, patient verbal instruction combined with emotional support. The Drachnari thrived on competitive challenges and group projects that channeled their natural aggression constructively. The Etherian bloomed when given opportunities for creative expression and artistic learning approaches. But it was Zix who showed the most dramatic progress. Through music, storytelling, and harmonic patterns, they began demonstrating understanding of concepts that should have been far beyond their supposed cognitive abilities. More remarkably, their solutions often revealed elegant approaches that the Academy's advanced systems had never considered. Word of Sarah's unorthodox methods began spreading through the Academy. Some faculty members were skeptical, viewing her approach as primitive and inefficient. Others were intrigued by the unexpected results she was achieving with students who had been written off as unteachable. Dr. Vexhai found themselves in an uncomfortable position, defending teaching methods they didn't fully understand to superiors who valued efficiency above all else. The Academy Board was beginning to ask pointed questions about why resources were being wasted on outdated approaches. Pressure came to a head when Professor Kethmer, an elderly crystalline instructor, approached Sarah after one of her classes. Unlike the younger generation of their species, Kethmer had lived through the transition from traditional harmonic learning to Neuralink education. "I have been watching your work with young Zix," Kethmer said, their own crystal form pulsing with complex patterns that Sarah's translator could only partially decode. "What you are doing, it reminds me of the old ways. The old ways." Kethmer's form darkened with what Sarah had learned indicated deep sorrow among crystallines. "My species once learned as you are teaching, through harmony, through resonance, through the music that lives in all mathematics and all knowledge. We were the galaxy's greatest innovators, our understanding limited only by the time it took to achieve perfect resonance with each new concept." "What happened?" "Efficiency," Kethmer said bitterly. "Neuralink education could teach in days what harmonic learning took years to achieve. We abandoned our gifts for the promise of faster results. We gained speed but lost our souls." Kethmer moved closer to observe Zix, who was creating increasingly complex harmonic patterns in response to Sarah's lessons. "Tell me, Professor Williams, have you heard of the grand resonance?" Sarah shook her head. "It was, the ultimate state of crystalline learning. When a young one achieved perfect harmonic balance, their understanding would transcend normal limitations. They could perceive connections between all forms of knowledge, solve problems by feeling the underlying mathematical music of the universe itself." Kethmer's patterns grew wistful. "No crystalline has achieved grand resonance in over 200 years. Most believe it is merely a myth." Sarah looked at Zix, who was generating patterns of increasing complexity and beauty. "What if it's not a myth? What if we just forgot how to teach it?" The crisis came suddenly. The Academy Board announced mandatory standardized testing for all students, including those in remedial programs. Sarah's students would be evaluated using the same Neuralink assessments that had consistently failed them in the past. Failure would result in transfer to basic life skills programs, effectively ending any hope of higher education. Sarah had 2 weeks to prepare students for a testing method that fundamentally contradicted everything she had learned about how they actually learned. "This is impossible," she told Dr. Vexhai during an emergency meeting. "You're asking them to demonstrate knowledge using a system that their minds literally cannot interface with." Vexhai's patterns showed genuine distress. "I understand your frustration, Professor, but the board's decision is final. The Academy cannot make exceptions to its evaluation standards." "Then the standards are wrong." The words hung in the air between them. It was a direct challenge to everything the Academy represented, and they both knew it. Sarah threw herself into preparation with desperate intensity. Working with Professor Kethmer, she developed what they called translation methods. ways to convert her students' natural learning styles into formats the Neuralink tests might recognize. For Zix, this meant trying to represent their sophisticated harmonic understanding through traditional mathematical notation. The work was exhausting. Sarah found herself staying up late into the night, pushing herself to find ways to help her students succeed within a system designed to exclude them. Her health suffered, but her determination never wavered. The day of testing arrived with the weight of institutional judgment. Students throughout the academy connected to Neuralink interfaces, their minds merging temporarily with vast information networks to demonstrate their knowledge and problem-solving abilities. Sarah's remedial students sat in a separate testing chamber, facing modified interfaces that had been adjusted for their supposed limitations. The tension in the room was palpable. Then disaster struck. Midway through the testing period, the Academy's Neuralink system experienced a catastrophic malfunction. Feedback loops in the quantum-enhanced networks created painful interference for every student connected to the system. Throughout the Academy, students cried out in pain and confusion as the direct brain interfaces overloaded. Emergency alarms blared as faculty rushed to disconnect students from the malfunctioning network. The Academy's perfect system had failed at the worst possible moment. But in the remedial testing chamber, something remarkable was happening. Sarah's students, who had never relied on Neuralink technology, were completely unaffected by the system failure. While mainstream students throughout the academy struggled with painful feedback, the 5 students everyone had written off as failures continued working calmly on their assessments. And Zix was doing something extraordinary. As the chaos of the system failure reached crescendo, Zix's crystal form began generating harmonic frequencies unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. The patterns flowing through their body became incredibly complex, three-dimensional mathematical structures that seemed to solve multiple problems simultaneously. Professor Kethmer, who had been monitoring the testing, gasped in recognition. "The grand resonance," they whispered. "Zix is achieving the grand resonance." The harmonic patterns flowing from Zix's body began resonating throughout the academy structure itself. Other crystallines, scattered throughout the building, stopped what they were doing as the ancient frequencies awakened something deep in their genetic memory. Zix wasn't just solving the test problems. They were revealing elegant solutions that surpassed anything the academy's advanced systems had ever produced. Mathematical relationships became visible as living light patterns in the air. Complex theoretical problems unfolded into beautiful geometric forms that made their solutions obvious. For the first time in centuries, crystallines throughout the academy remembered what their species had once been capable of. The aftermath of the testing crisis forced a complete reevaluation of the academy's educational philosophy. As Neuralink systems were repaired and investigators tried to understand the malfunction, one fact became undeniable. The students everyone had considered failures had not only survived the crisis, but had demonstrated capabilities that transcended the limitations of the technology that had failed. Dr. Vexhai found themselves in the unusual position of defending methods they had initially opposed. Standing before the Academy board, they presented evidence of what Sarah's primitive approaches had accomplished. "Perhaps," Vexhai said, their patterns shifting to show newfound conviction, "our definition of advancement needs to be reconsidered. We have been so focused on the speed of learning that we have forgotten its depth." The board's reaction was mixed, but the results spoke for themselves. Zix's achievement of grand resonance had created ripple effects throughout the crystalline community. Other members of their species began requesting access to traditional harmonic learning methods. The Skittari collective sent representatives to study kinesthetic educational approaches. The Mollusk Federation wanted to understand how emotional support enhanced learning outcomes. Sarah found herself at the center of a paradigm shift she had never intended to create. 3 months later, the Academy announced the establishment of a new Department of Alternative Learning Sciences, with Sarah as its director. Her former remedial classroom had expanded into an entire wing of the Academy, where students from multiple species learned according to their natural cognitive gifts rather than standardized technological interfaces. Zix, now recognized as a prodigy whose harmonic understanding surpassed most adult crystallines, chose to remain as Sarah's teaching assistant. Together with Professor Kethmer, they developed programs to restore traditional crystalline education alongside modern methods. The changes spread beyond Nexus Prime. Academy branches throughout the galaxy began incorporating diverse learning approaches inspired by Sarah's work. Human educators, once dismissed as representing a primitive species, found themselves in high demand as consultants and teachers. Sarah often reflected on the irony that her failure on Earth had led to her greatest success among the stars. The special education methods that budget-conscious administrators had deemed expendable were now being studied and implemented across multiple worlds. 1 year after her arrival at the academy, Sarah stood in her expanded classroom, watching students from 6 different species work together on a complex mathematical problem. The Skittari student bounced excitedly as they built a kinesthetic model. The mollusk offered gentle encouragement to a struggling peer. The Drachnari led a competitive team-solving exercise. The Etherian painted mathematical relationships in light patterns across the ceiling. And Zix, their crystal form now flowing through colors that had no names in human language, generated harmonic resonances that helped their classmates understand concepts in ways that Neuralink technology could never achieve. Sarah picked up her grandmother's guitar and began to play, not because the lesson required it, but because music had become the natural language of learning in her classroom. As the melody filled the air, her students' various forms of expression synchronized into a symphony of understanding that was greater than the sum of its parts. Dr. Vexhai, now one of Sarah's strongest advocates, paused in the doorway to watch. Their bioluminescent patterns had evolved to include new frequencies, colors that expressed concepts that had no equivalent in their species' traditional emotional spectrum. "Remarkable," Vexhai murmured to Professor Kethmer, who stood beside them. "Who would have thought that the most advanced teaching methods would be the ones we had dismissed as primitive?" Kethmer's crystal form pulsed with harmonics that translated as profound satisfaction. Perhaps that is the most important lesson of all, that wisdom often comes disguised as simplicity, and that the longest path sometimes leads to the most beautiful destinations. In the classroom, Sarah finished her song and looked around at her students, no longer remedial cases, but young beings who were learning to think, create, and discover in ways their species had forgotten were possible. She had come to the academy believing she might have something to teach the galaxy's most advanced civilization. She had never imagined that the greatest lesson would be remembering that every mind learns differently, and that true education means meeting students where they are rather than forcing them to conform to where we think they should be. As the lesson continued and her students explored new concepts through music, movement, storytelling, and harmonic resonance, Sarah smiled. Sometimes the most revolutionary act was simply refusing to give up on someone everyone else had written off as hopeless. And sometimes, in the space between giving up and trying again, miracles found room to grow.